Calling, 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 calling. Call the Growth Buster. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Welcome to the Growth Busters podcast, where we discuss our society's addiction to growth, and we try to get it into a 12-step program. On a full planet, we think it's time that we stop expanding the scale of the human enterprise. And that means the number of people and the amount of stuff we consume and the amount of stuff we spit out. I'm Dave Gardner, one of your co-hosts, and I'm joined today by...
Hi, I'm Ben Bacher. I'm an assistant growth buster.
I'm Caitlin Hickman, and I am also an assistant growth buster.
I feel like you guys are like in a master's program or something. I really value your participation in these podcasts. I'm hoping that it makes it pretty interesting to your peers. But I also do feel like you guys probably learn something interesting every podcast as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, me too. So it's working really well. And I'm excited today because we have a special guest. But before we bring him on, I just want to mention this interesting news story that just came across the transom just yesterday, I think it was, that the Food and Drug Administration has told a Massachusetts bakery to remove love from its list of ingredients on its granola. So I want to ask you, Caitlin, because I know you hate food. How do you get love into food in the first place? And if you can, is it an important ingredient?
I think it's a very important ingredient. I don't have much else to say about that, but I think it's silly that it's not allowed to be listed.
Yeah, I'm going to pontificate. Count me down 10 seconds. I think when you know the people who are preparing your food,
yes,
and when the people preparing the food know their customers really well, then they're probably putting love into it.
They're allowed to list it.
So all the things that we promote in terms of buying local food, buying organic food, buying food that's been grown more by hand than by machine, I think that's love going into that food. And shame on the FDA for getting in the way of that, although they're not stopping them from putting love into it, at least. Huh?
It's true. And as the resident devil's advocate, there's not necessarily things from a large corporation don't have love in them. You never know.
God, I thought he was our resident communist. That just doesn't really sound like. That doesn't sound like you, Ben. But Ben was suit shopping not that long ago, so he's getting ready to sell out.
It's true. Yeah. I'm going into big oil after I graduate.
I knew it. Okay, well, we're going to kind of continue a conversation we started in our last episode where we talked about Florida and Houston setting themselves up for serious storm and rising sea level damage because they have this grow at all costs philosophy. They've paved over a lot of natural storm defense in order to add people and make money. It's not that unique either, other than the fact that they're sitting at sea level and they were in the path of recent hurricanes. Cities everywhere are addicted to growth, and so we're going to talk a little bit more about urban growth today. And Caitlin, we have a really special guest, don't we?
Yes. So I mentioned on the last episode, I'm from Bend, Oregon, and I recently visited home and learned that Bend is the fastest growing city in the U.S. right now. And that really surprised me. And today we're talking to my dad, who is the director of the Engineering and Infrastructure Planning Department for the city of Bend, which is super relevant. His name is Tom Hickman, and he has been an engineer for 15 years. And he's done a lot of interesting projects with the city. But he told me today that the most relevant thing is that he introduced the use of genetic algorithms for planning water and sewer systems and how that has significantly changed how the city plans for growth.
Well, I'm impressed already, Tom. You must be really pretty intelligent guy because you're probably taken out every day for 3 martini lunches by real estate developers.
No, but some days I wish that was the truth. No, actually, I mean, one of the things that's kind of neat about my department is I typically don't interact directly with the development interests. So the way we're organized is a bit unique in that way, and I think that's a good thing.
Why?
The way this city grew historically, it really was run by development interests. And when I first came to the city, it was very clear to me that developers would come and meet with me and they would expect me to comply with what they had requested. And I didn't see that as right. I just thought that was a bad way to grow. And so I started pushing back. And as a result, over the years, we spent time reorganizing our city. And now we have a private development department that does coordinate directly with those development interests. But then that development department has to come to me to get approval for infrastructure changes. So it creates this buffer that allows me a little more flexibility in being able to, I guess, do the right thing.
Wow, that is another mark in the intelligent column, I think, for you, Tom. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're saying that you have a department whose customer is the developer, but you are separate and your customer is the citizen.
Yes, absolutely. And all of my staff are very aware of that. We're very focused on the fact that we're here to serve the community.
Man, that is so cool, because I'll tell you, here in Colorado Springs, my hometown, we haven't figured that out. In fact, I want to really recommend that they take a look at that model that Bend is. Maybe you're pioneering that. I'm not sure how many cities are doing that, but in our town here, Tom, the planning department, their customer is the development and building community, and you can just tell all of their metrics, everything that they do. If they make a change, it has to be, number one, they hardly make a change if it doesn't get the blessing of the Housing and Building Association, but they also have to justify it, that it's going to save the builder's money or the developer's money or streamline the process. If it's just protecting the integrity of the community, it's really low on the list, unfortunately.
Wow. I wish I could say that's surprising, but unfortunately in my line of work, it's not. I've interacted with communities across the country, and most are in the situation that Colorado Springs is in, that they find themselves really having to serve the development interests. And I'm pretty fortunate that we have a city manager that has agreed to take this approach that we're taking, and he also is from a very community-centric perspective. Well,
if the real estate developers in Bend are anything like the ones here, you guys will both be fired soon.
Well, in actuality, one of the things that we did is I just went straight to the development community at one point and talked to them about all of this. And it took a while, but they actually saw the benefit. And I think if you can explain it, and especially getting everyday citizens on board so that they're there to help back you up, that was probably the biggest game changer for me, was getting everyday citizens to get involved and back me up so that I didn't feel threatened every day.
When you say the development group started to get it, do you mean that they started to see that it had community impacts, or it had like personal economic impacts for like benefits for them?
What I was able to show them was a lot of the practices that they were using were costing ratepayers and taxpayers a lot of money down the road. So development interests, their line of work is to look at profit margins, and so they're focused on that immediate investment. But my focus is not the immediate investment. My focus is the very long-term investment and impact from that investment.
Man, there's a third column. Check. It's really great to hear that, Tom. Sorry for interrupting you.
No, so that's what I've really spent a lot of time getting them to understand, that their role is fine. They can think that way, but my role is different, and that they have to respect the perspective I bring to the table as well, and that if the community sees that this is going to harm them, they're certainly not going to back it.
What do you think other communities could do to make that model more possible?
You know, Kayla, this has probably been one of the frustrations in my career. I've spent a lot of time going to other communities, talking to other special districts and people in my position in those places. And I think, since I'm an engineer, I'm pretty comfortable knocking them. One of the things as engineers is we tend to very much think not very dynamically, very black box. This worked here, so we're going to repeat it here. And the minute somebody comes in and says, wait a minute, we want you to do this differently, we want you to think about this differently, most of the time, the very first people that respond to it are the engineers. And they're the very first ones to say, no, it won't work. And so I have found myself really struggling with my own profession, my colleagues, and getting them to understand that, hey, there's a different way to approach this. There's a different way to think about this. And I have spoken at conferences across the country on this. And, you know, I'd like to think I'm slowly changing it, but I'll admit it's slow.
You also mentioned that there's a law that you can't limit growth through your infrastructure projects. Do you want to explain that too? Because that also, that seems like something different than what you're talking about, but also really relevant.
Very interested in that, yeah.
Yeah, so first off, I want to make clear I'm not a land use attorney, and I'm not a formal planner. My education is formally in engineering. However, to do what I've done and to make things work, I have integrated with land use attorneys and integrated with the planning departments. So I understood their languages and what they're doing and what they have to do. So I just want to give that perspective. So as I give the history here, you can kind of understand where I'm coming from. But back in 1973, our governor, Tom McCall at the time, ironically, a Republican governor, was really dismayed at the growth that was happening across Oregon. And he saw these beautiful sagebrush areas getting mowed under. He saw beautiful fields and loamy farm fields getting tilled over. And, you know, that kind of stuff was upsetting to him. And so he's the one who actually was able to push through Senate Bill 100 at the time. And it was revolutionary. It was revolutionary. We were the first state in the country to have done it. And we created these land use laws. But anytime you create these laws, the only way to get them done is there's often compromise. And so while I wasn't there at the time, what I believe happened is one of the compromises that was made, because the law really forces us to not look to additional land to grow. It forces us as a community to look at what we have and how can we use it more effectively and more efficiently. And that was a whole new way to think about growth, period, across this country. And so when we do that, of course, the development community and the builders at the time certainly pushed back on that. And over the years, there were a number of attempts to repeal the laws that all failed. But what they did get through was this idea that, okay, you still have an obligation as a community to address this growth. You have to have a land supply and, you know, facilities to serve that land. So you can't turn us away if you can't serve us for some reason. So what that required is every community to have what they call a 20-year land supply that was divided up, meeting the needs for residential, commercial, industrial, and government, you know, educational type uses. And so when communities develop that 20-year supply, once we've said, okay, this is where that land is, then I have an obligation to serve those lands with water, sewer, transportation, those kinds of things. And to be clear, it's not me alone. There's several of us that get involved in this stuff. But when we get to a point, and this recently happened, it was very stressful, really started about 2010, where our sewer system had reached a point of capacity in numerous parts of the city. And I was the first person that they knew of in the history of the city where I said, no, we can't take any more and stop. We're not approving anymore. And that really shot off a firestorm. And to be honest with you, I did it pretty ignorantly at the time. I didn't even understand this law was in place. But what happened is then I had to learn about this law, and I realized I had 120 days to respond if we were going to formally declare a moratorium. And most cities don't formally do it. Normally you get challenged to do it by what they call patterns in practice. So if you have a pattern in practice of rejecting growth, then you fall into this law that you have to respond, and you have 120 days to develop a plan of how you're going to meet that need. And then you have up to 6 months to correct it, which from an engineering perspective is pretty ludicrous.
Yeah, really.
to be honest with you, because very few things can get built in that kind of time frame. So that's the history of it. That's kind of how it came to be. That's how we've used it here. But fortunately for us, again, it was one of those things where I did end up meeting with a lot of the development community, and I explained the situation. And when we sat down and explained it to them, they understood that we didn't have any quick fix to this. Even if the law mandated it, there was no quick fix. And that we really needed a lot better study to address it. So nobody ended up declaring a moratorium, but they agreed to basically not apply to do growth in these areas where we had no capacity.
Okay, I want to ask a couple questions, because one thing kind of strikes me that it seems contradictory, that it seemed like you said that these land use laws enacted in 1973 forced the community to not look at additional land to grow, but to try to find other ways to accommodate growth. But then this compromise is that you have to have a 20-year plan, and it sounds like it's a 20-year plan to look to additional land. So what nuance am I missing here, Tom?
Yeah, no, it does seem contradictory, and it did to me. But if you look what was going on before that law was in place, essentially planners, people like myself could sit down and we would just draw on a map additional lands to bring in without much consideration to that impact. And what this law did is it basically said, okay, within your current growth boundary, what available land supply do you have? So in other words, can you increase density? What are the things that you could do to serve the community into the future with the land supply you have? And that plan goes to the state board of land use, and they look at it, and if you can't convince them that you've looked at all of your options internally, then they won't approve any growth externally. And to make this very real, the city of Bend, because we are so rapidly growing, we just went through this process. And it actually started in 2004, 2005. And at the time, there was a very different staff involved at the city at the time. And they did exactly what I just explained. They drew essentially a square around the city and then justified the need for that additional acreage. And that acreage was around 8,000 acres or 10,000 acres of additional land to bring into the city for growth. That plan was brought before the Land Use Board of Appeals, and the board rejected it and said, nope, you got to go back to the drawing board, and you need to look at your land use supply that you have internally. And there were really a long list of very specific requirements that we had to meet. And we did. And by then I was engaged and working here, and I worked closely with the land use attorneys and the planners. And what we ended up doing, it took us several years, But we did end up going back to the Land Use Board of Appeals to ask for additional land, but we went from, I think it was 8,000 acres, we went down to 2,000 acres of additional land. And so there still is, growth happening that we got to do, but you can see that it just in that example, it's the difference between completely unchecked, unregulated, and a regulated system. And the other thing we had to look at was we had to answer things like soil types. What kind of environment are you impacting by this growth? And so we had to look at all that stuff very carefully to show that the lands that we even chose had minimal impact.
What's the state's motivation for wanting to keep the cities in Oregon from just continually physically expanding?
If you haven't been to our state, I kind of think it's a pretty beautiful state. And we have a lot of forest areas and a lot of really beautiful areas. And I think that the community as a state realized we really wanted to preserve these. We didn't want every river with homes butted up against the river all the way down, a corridor. We realized we wanted, these really preserved areas for long into the future. And I really do think that's what drove all of this. And one of the things that you can see here is there are many places that look ideal to build homes along some of the rivers here and beautiful views, but there are none. And there won't be any because those areas get protected by this land use law.
So why not just have the state prevent that and let the cities stop growing if they feel like they've reached their capacity?
Yeah, and I think, again, I wasn't there when the law was written or passed, but from the research I did, what it appeared to me was in order to get the law passed, this agreement came up of, well, how then are you going to allow growth to happen?
Oh, yeah, the compromise, yeah.
And I think that was the compromise. And so now it's up to people like myself that work in these communities to be more responsible, to take a different approach. And so as Caitlin mentioned in my introduction, that one of the things that I brought to the city was the idea of using genetic algorithms to help us plan for how we grow these systems. And that has been a game changer for us as a city. And it's really been a game changer for even my profession. It's one of those things we're starting to see the use of this grow.
Do you want to explain what they are?
Yeah.
Caitlin's looking at me and she says, boy, he went right over Dave's head on that one.
So, the first time I brought this in front of city council, I got so excited talking about genetic algorithms, they actually had to stop me. So,
they confiscate your pocket protector?
Exactly. So, back in the 70s, really in the 80s, there was an engineer who was looking at these water systems, drinking water supplies, sewer systems, and stormwater systems. And he was looking at them in these communities, and basically the way he saw them was that these were almost living organisms, and that these organisms grew to meet the demand of the living body it was trying to serve. And as he looked at it, he started thinking about the concept of, well, why wouldn't this grow like any other living thing? And so over a course of many years, they developed a set of algorithms that are incredibly complex. There's nothing simple or easy about them, but essentially what he did is he created DNA identifiers for different elements of systems. And with the use of a lot of computing power, he allows these algorithms to run and allow these systems to grow in a way that they grow to be their most efficient self. So the idea here being is if you understand that life tends to grow to be its most efficient self in the environment that it's in, this follows the same thinking, that these systems will grow to be their most efficient self. And there's a big benefit there, because typically when you run this, you find you don't need as much as traditional methods of doing this kind of work. And there's a huge savings in terms of dollars to a community, including to development. So it's one of these things that it's hard to argue against. Once you see it used and you start realizing, wow, this is a really smart way to handle growth and to start addressing this in a much more responsible manner. And the other thing about this tool is that it removes my personal bias, and frankly, it removes anybody else's personal bias. So if I put in a particular engineering bias, it really sticks out like a sore thumb when you run the model, and on the output side of it, it's really evident that you biased it to come out a certain way. So that's one of the most powerful things about this, is that I can take the values of the environmental community, I can take the values of the development community, I can take the values of residents, and I can take the engineering values, and I can put those all into this model to guide it and to guide how it makes its decisions. And then the great part is after I get answers from it, I'm not done. I then look to do additional analysis to say, well, why didn't it pick this more environmental friendly option? And we can actually go then and analyze that really specifically to see why didn't it pick that? And then if we see that, well, the only reason it didn't pick it was because it was really expensive, now the community can make a value decision to say, it's worth it to us to make a higher level investment to have that environmental benefit.
So can you weight things so that, certain environmental considerations could be deal breakers?
You can weight it, but again, the nice part is it's not done in a, secret. It's a conscious decision made by everybody to weight it that direction and to say that's the output I want to get. And it really does show up that, okay, you're willing to spend more to get this other option.
Well, you have really blown my mind. In fact, I'm going to get on Amazon and order genetic algorithms for dummies right away.
So I'm really fortunate. I really kind of stumbled into this. The firm that had done this was a small firm in the United States. And frankly, they weren't having a lot of success in using this in the United States, but it was being widely used in other countries.
By those communists in Europe, right?
Yeah. They're kind of bright. So, basically when one of the owners of the company happened to be in Bend, knew a friend of mine and heard about me, and we went out together and had a beer, and he sat down and showed this to me, and I had a hydraulic modeling background, so I understood the traditional methods of doing all this work. And what I saw when he ran this, it absolutely stunned me. It blew me away. I didn't think it was possible, and I actually thought when he did it, it was a gimmick. And so it sent me on this journey of really digging into it. And the more I dug, the more I learned, no, it can really do this. And
it's weird to have a system described as a self. That language strikes me as being really, really bizarre. So I understand why you would have thought that it might be a gimmick, because it just sounds sort of absurd to say that a system can grow like a person. I don't know, that metaphor.
Yeah, it does. But I've gotten, over the years now, I've certainly dug into this much more, and I've used it. I've probably used this more than any other city in the United States at this point. And I now much better understand the details and nuances of how it's working and how they set up these DNA identifiers for these systems. And, once you get to that level of detail, you really start to understand that, yeah, this is a living system. And if you look at them that way, you start to think about then a community growing in terms of being its most efficient self for the environment it's in.
Well, when you think about it, you would expect you need something pretty revolutionary and supercomputing power for a city like Bend to grow from, what was the population when you were in high school there, Caitlin?
I think it was like 80,000.
And what is it now, 10 or 12 million today, isn't it, Tom?
Oh, no. Although it didn't feel that way. During tourist season, it feels that way. But
yeah.
We're up to about 92,000 now. And actually, when Caitlin was in high school, it was actually down about 78,000.
So that's rapid enough growth, because I really should have asked her what it was when she was in kindergarten, because it was only yesterday she was in high school.
We have literally exploded. We consistently make the top 10 lists in best places to live, the most environmentally friendly, the most dog friendly, all these categories, and we consistently are in the top 10. But one of the ones that we're in the top 10 of consistently is entrepreneurial and venture capital, which is kind of interesting to think about, that we're a small community still relative, and yet we do have a lot of economic vitality here. And while we're growing in population, we're not busting out the seams. We're not building homes up into the mountains and forest area. And I do have to give credit to groups that I have to find myself oftentimes in opposition to just because of my role. But those groups, they know the law and they use it to push back, and rightfully so. And
you're talking about environmental groups, right?
Yes. And so I think we got to stop viewing this stuff as a conflict, a fight. Having this push and pull, challenging of ideas, we should see it all as very healthy. And I think ultimately rational people can come around a table and have a rational discussion about these things and make good decisions, instead of being in these very cornered positions where, growth at any cost, basically, completely stop it 100%. And one of the problems with doing that is you then drive up land values, and affordability then becomes a major issue. So, we got to find a responsible way to do all this.
It's interesting to hear that perspective, because I talked to you about this a little bit earlier in the week, and you were talking about just acknowledging the need for people to grow based on population growth. Like, if it was up to you, maybe you would limit how many kids people could have, or just encourage more responsible decision making in general and people pursuing less capital. But acknowledging that that is the way that people are right now, your role in this is to make space for growth sometimes.
Well, yeah. So from a very personal perspective, I don't believe we have infinite supplies. we don't have infinite resources.
What?
So it's not a ridiculous leap then to say, okay, there's got to be some limit, and maybe we've already passed that limit. But unfortunately, or I don't know whether it's unfortunate or fortunate, we can't literally go into people's bedrooms and stop them from procreating. We can't do those kinds of very draconian things. All we can do is educate and hope you get those messages across. But at the same time, look at, okay, so if we're going to grow, how do we do it in a more responsible way? And do it in a way that we're not thinking about growing big, but we think about just being big within what we have.
So a more responsible way, ideally.
Yeah, and that does, in order to do it, you're going to reduce your demand on resources. You're going to use less. And to make that very real again here, since about 2000, we've added obviously thousands and thousands of people to this city. But if you look at our peak water use over that same time frame, it's hardly changed. And so you can add people to these systems and they don't necessarily have to get bigger. So it's a paradigm shift in how we think about this stuff.
Well, Tom, you were just like right on the edge of just falling out of favor with me. I just thought the next sentence you were going to say smart growth, but you never said smart growth. So good for you.
To me, it's one of those words. It's kind of, I don't know, cliche. People throw it around and they think if they say it, that somehow then they've done it. And so I don't like using those terms.
Smarter growth.
You're just more. I like to think of it as more responsible.
Yeah, I think that was probably a better way to put it. And I'm tempted to just throw out a really bizarre idea here. Why not? So you talked about the very real problem that if you were to stop development, then you would have an affordability issue. And of course, that's something that's every time anyone uses Boulder, Colorado as an example, because they probably have done the closest thing to stopping growth of any city in the U.S. that I'm aware of. And certainly it has become pretty unaffordable to live in Boulder. But I'm just wondering if it really did become super unaffordable to buy a house or rent an apartment in community after community after community, then the young people, when they get out of school, they'd have no choice but to do what Ben did. I don't know if you know, but in our last episode, Ben here dropped a bombshell and told us he was not only was he going to buy a suit, sell out to corporate America, but he was also going to move back in with his parents. Now, and I'm just thinking, Tom, stick with me here and see if this seems logical. So if it really did become so unaffordable that every child you conceive you knew was going to move back in with you, wouldn't that encourage you to stop conceiving kids?
Well, it would certainly stop me.
What are you saying?
But fair enough. And I guess I see that a little bit differently in that my concern really is we continue then this economic rift that we have even greater. And the way I see it changing, frankly, and this is very real, it's people like Caitlin and Ben who they weren't brought up, I don't think, with kind of what I was taught. You got to go get that home right away. You got to get the white picket fence and their view on what they want and what they value in life was very, very different than mine. And we are seeing that in our community. We're seeing the younger people that are coming into the community. They're saying, I don't want a big house. I don't want this massive house. I don't want a big yard. And so kind of all of the economic systems that kind of have been in place, they're changing. They're going to have to change to address these different sets of values. And of course, then we can start looking at, okay, well, then how do we start then putting in these smaller homes and how do we take some of these bigger homes, frankly, the home that Caitlin grew up in, and how do we allow them to divide it up so that maybe 2 or 3 families can be in that same space? And
wouldn't they be fighting over time in the swimming pool and on the tennis court?
Well, it's not that
quite.
Nice of a house.
But you didn't mention, when you were giving this great list of value change that you're seeing, which is all good, you didn't mention family size too. Don't you see that changing too?
Yeah. Yep. We're seeing definitely people being much more thoughtful about the size of families they're having. And we hear that frequently here. So we're seeing a lot of changing values. People now are much more conscious about what demand they're having on the resources. They're considering things about, why do I want a lawn? What's the point of a lawn? Can I do things to have less impact? In other words, can I, maybe flush the toilet less, be more careful about what I'm putting down the drain, which then starts to constrain some of these systems, and we start to have to do less and use less.
Mom is less likely to tell me that she wants grandkids than she used to be. So that's progress.
Well, I can certainly see, Tom, why I liked Caitlin instantly, and I think so highly of her. She's come from good stock. It's really been this has really been a pleasure getting to know you. And I'm not trying to race this off. Caitlin, was there anything else that you wanted to talk with Tom about?
No, I think we covered a lot. Thanks for your work, Dad.
You're welcome, and hopefully this was beneficial.
How about you, Ben? Any questions you couldn't get in edgewise?
No. Thanks for coming on, Tom. Yeah, I kind of got sidetracked looking at genetic algorithms. It looks so interesting, the limitations. I tried not to, but I looked at the Wikipedia page, and then it seems fascinating. But
he didn't take his Adderall today, I don't think. Well, it's been a pleasure, Tom. So thanks a lot for visiting with us. Thanks a lot for giving us Caitlin. Maybe we'll find a way to help you spread the good word about the genetic algorithms.
Well, there's a lot more, in terms of, it's also like it all started when we started about how we structure our governments too. That's all part of it. And so there's a lot of pieces to work on here, and they all need worked on. And we need community citizens that are willing to invest the time to do them. We need smarter leadership. I mean, we need, frankly, people like Caitlin and Ben to get in leadership positions and help us make better choices.
All right.
That's nice.
It's a nice way to wrap up. Thanks again, Tom, very much.
All right. Take care. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Caitlin, for introducing us to your dad. What a bright guy and interesting thinking.
No problem. I think so, too.
Same.
Yeah, it was good to have him on.
Yeah. Okay, so now it's that time of the show again where we get to talk about lightening the load.
Woo!
Caitlin, I think you went last time, so why don't you go first?
Okay. Yeah, I came up with one on the cuff again a couple minutes ago. But mine this week is, I spent last year, the fall semester, in India, and I burned a lot of carbon to get there. But my lifestyle there taught me a lot of things. And one of the things that it taught me is that I don't need nearly as many clothes as I have, because I only took with me a backpacking backpack. And I alternated between 4 outfits the entire 4 months that I was there. And just realized, one of the biggest ways that I see capitalism and growth manifest in the US is through the clothing industry. So I like, when I do buy clothes, to try to buy them at thrift shops. We just already have so much clothing. We really don't need to support clothing companies that are big corporations that are making new stuff to keep up with trends.
So you're limiting the number of outfits even today back here in the U.S.? Not to
more
4.
so than I used to. Yeah, when I got back, I donated a lot of my clothes, and I try to only buy things that I really, really love now, which is also more cost efficient.
All right. Very good. Very good.
Cool. Yeah, well, I don't want to scare Dave with thoughts of his children coming home. So this week I chose a water.
I really do love my kids.
If they're listening to this. But I chose a water-related one. And as I mentioned before, I'm from Northern California, where there's a real water and drought crisis. So one thing I practice when I'm there and when I'm in Colorado is that when I shower after I've shampooed and I'm ready to put on soap, I just turn off the water. And I probably save about a minute or a minute and a half of water, probably a couple gallons. But if you add that up over the whole year, it's pretty significant. And it still stays pretty hot. And when you turn the water on, it gets hot right away. So I think that's something that's been pretty easy for me to implement.
Yep. Good suggestion. Good suggestion. So I have a pretty interesting one this episode, because this is something I do frequently here in town and on road trips, but I don't very often do it when I'm flying. And I did have to fly not too long ago, and I implemented it in flight and have an interesting tale to tell about it. So my lightening the load tip for this episode is that I did finally get sick of the disposable cups every time I went to a coffee shop. And I tend to have many of my meetings in great coffee shops here in town, and I would be given a disposable cup. And so the right thing to do for the environment is to bring your own reusable cup so that nothing is going into the wastebasket. And so I have a couple of these cups that I like to use, and I'll take those on road trips and take that in town when I go to a meeting. If I'm going to a coffee shop where I know they don't have mugs, that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. I'm not crazy about coffee shops where the only choice is a disposable cup. Did you know you can't recycle those cups?
Really?
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, apparently there's like a lining that they put in them to keep them from leaking, and that makes them not
Interesting. I think
recyclable.
Does it depend on because I know at least the ones they have at CC, it says recyclable on them, but maybe it's not for certain kinds.
Well, we should investigate that. Maybe there are some certain ones.
Some good companies, yeah.
And of course, as you know, recycling information is kind of a moving target. So
right.
Very true.
So I might be misleading you. So if you're listening to this and you have some expertise in that area, we'd love it if you'd comment or write or call and straighten us out on that. So I'm flying to Virginia a few weeks ago, and I take my reusable cup with me. So I go to the coffee shop before I get on the plane. I hand them my cup and I say, I want to get a skinny mocha in this cup. And they take the cup and they go over to the espresso machine and they proceed to make me a cup of coffee in a disposable cup.
Oh my God.
And then pour it into my reusable cup. Oh, I just died.
Yeah, that's absurd.
And it happened twice that day. Because
What?
I had to change planes.
Jeez.
So I did that twice. Both airports, both coffee shops, they did the same
That's
thing.
crazy.
I wonder if that's a food safety requirement, in which case it shouldn't be. Yeah, I wonder if they're allowed to take anybody's.
Right.
Yeah, but it would definitely defeat the whole purpose of...
Right.
Yeah. So I was really bummed by that. Another thing to research one of these days when we have nothing better to do would be why some coffee shops may have a rule about that.
Huh.
Yeah.
So that brings us to the conclusion of another exciting, earth-shaking episode of the Growth Busters podcast, where you certainly learn something new every time. How many podcasts have you listened to about genetic algorithms just in the last couple of days?
None.
Anyway?
It's
But
crazy.
I can't say that much about them now, except that I think that they're a good thing.
Sounds like it, probably. All right, so we want to encourage you to get out there and bust some growth until next time.
Adios.
See you next week.
Sayonara.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling. Call the growth busters.